We read this morning from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. I have a little show and tell for you this morning with some artifacts from my past. I found these in an old jewelry box amid the pieces of costume jewelry and old driver's licenses and some high school mementos. What I have here is some buttons with various slogans. Now this one has a cow on it, and the cow is saying "no nukes." And here's one with a nuclear power plant on it, and the nuclear power plant is saying "no cows." Oh, the humor of the 1970s. And I have some Moravian buttons. This one says John Huss Power. This one comes from a youth convocation that my older brothers attended. And this one is from the convo that I attended myself in Bethlehem in 1975. And it says, "We are 5 loaves and 2 fish." Now, of course, you know the source of that reference. It's the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke and also Mark and Matthew. Jesus feeding thousands with only a tiny bit of bread and fish is the only miracle story included in all 4 Gospels. We really cannot overstate the importance of this story to our understanding of Jesus. Now, the basic details are consistent from gospel to gospel. There's a crowd of at least 5,000 people. The question arises, how will these people eat? An inventory of resources reveals only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Yet the people are made to sit down. Jesus gives thanks, and the food is distributed. Everyone eats as much as he wants, and the leftover pieces fill 12 baskets. Apart from these details, there are some different frames, some different interpretations, but the common characteristic is a sense of great abundance. And this is the Jesus that all 4 Gospels want us to know. The Jesus who trusts that God can provide for everyone's needs, even more than everyone's needs. Not just abundance, but superabundance, more even than we need. So why is it important to gather the leftovers? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the leftovers are almost an afterthought. But in John's version, which we just read, Jesus draws attention to the broken pieces. Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. But if that happened, couldn't Jesus just make more bread? Why make a fuss about a few lost fragments? The theme of Convo 75 is easy to understand. We are 5 loaves and 2 fish, clearly meant that Jesus would distribute us throughout the multitude to meet the needs of the world. There were more than 300 of us at that convo. I thank Richard Starbuck for checking that in the archives for me. But still, that is not a lot to feed the whole world. Like the loaves and fishes, we seem too impossibly few to meet the need. Yet, with the blessing of Christ, whatever we offered to feed the world would be multiplied in superabundance. Speaking for the friends I'm still in touch with who attended Convo 75, I can say that mostly we have tried to be those loaves and fishes, meeting the needs of the world. Besides at least one Moravian pastor, there is a radiologist, a life coach, 2 school teachers, a physician's assistant. That's just the folks I can think of off the top of my head. I think that for most of us, church took, and Convo took. At least we grew up with a sense of mission and a sense of responsibility to serve. We were 5 loaves and 2 fish, and we still are 40 years later. Still, 40 years. Life is tough. And over the course of 40 years, people have suffered its random blows. I've kept in touch with my Convo friends enough to know about the hardships in their personal lives. Meanwhile, they have also suffered the emotional toll of their work. The impossibility of curing every suffering patient, mending every broken heart, fostering success in every student. And the frustrations of watching their professions change and feeling that they are helping fewer and fewer people. After 40 or more years in service to the world, the loaves and fishes may feel reduced to just so many fragments. And as fragments, can they still really be useful to anyone? Imagine the fragments of bread and fish lying on the ground after the feeding of the 5,000, scattered on the grass. Can't they just lie there? While the crowd they fed arises satisfied from their meal and moves on with life, can't we just lie here? The professional name for this fragmented state is burnout. And I don't know if this next little factoid is accurate, but I saw one claim that the term burnout first appeared in 1975. Maybe someone was first writing about burnout while we young Moravians were at Convo learning to feed ourselves to the world. Another source defines burnout as a progressive loss of idealism, energy, and purpose. Those words are written about the helping professions, but I think the phenomenon of burnout is much wider, and I'm very sure that it also exists among church volunteers. Because church work can also wear folks out. You don't have to be an alumnus of Convo 75 to know that Jesus calls the church to serve. We're called to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick and imprisoned. And on top of that, there's the organizational work. Volunteers keep the church existing as an institution so that it can feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and so on. And a lot of times, frankly, it's this organizational work, the committee assignments and so on, that burn volunteers out the fastest, because that's the work that has the least immediate reward. People volunteer because they want to make a difference in the world. But when we're sitting in another committee meeting, that difference might not be immediately obvious. Church leadership blogger Brian Dodd quotes one burned-out volunteer who told him, "I don't sense I'm making an eternal impact, and I don't know what I'm doing is impactful for today. I feel like if I'm there or not, it doesn't make any difference." Meanwhile, just like the doctors and teachers and others who burn out in the helping professions, church volunteers are struggling with the problems of their personal lives. And sometimes they have the feeling that no one else in the church knows or cares. It's no wonder Brian Dodd's volunteer declares, "I just feel burnt out. I just want to go sit down." That is the sound of a fragment of bread falling to the ground. Quite possibly, it is also the sound of a volunteer thinking about leaving the church. Wouldn't that be easier? When you feel there's not enough left of you to feed anybody, wouldn't it be easier to just give up? All who work and work to feed the people, all who serve and serve the church, all those years of service can leave the loaves and fishes feeling like pieces of their former selves. And maybe sometimes they're tempted to just settle to the ground and stay there, to give up not only the work of the church, but even church itself. After all, who would miss a fragment? According to John, Jesus would. Jesus, who tells the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." In the Gospel of John, the fragments of the feast are not an afterthought gathered into baskets by unnamed persons. John's Jesus purposefully sends the disciples to gather the fragments because he is not willing that one fragment of those loaves and fish should be lost. In Jesus' eyes, there is no bread so broken that it cannot be of use, no fragment too small to nourish someone. So he tells the disciples to pick up the pieces. I'm struck by that. Jesus cares about the pieces, but gathering them is a job for the disciples. I think we should assume that it still is. It is the hands of Christ that bless us and send us into the world, but it is the work of the church to pick up our own broken pieces and help those who have served themselves into fragmentation to find wholeness again. Home Moravian Church is full of loaves and fishes. I see you in every pew, blessed and distributed by Christ throughout Winston-Salem to serve our neighbors. I see people who serve through their daily occupations in the helping professions. I see people who lie awake at night worrying about how they can do more to help the hurting people in this world. I see lots and lots of loving volunteers who give huge amounts of time and energy to the work of this church, even as they struggle with upheaval and tragedy and exhaustion in their personal lives. I rejoice over how the members of Home Church are nourishing the world. But Jesus' concern for what's left over reminds me that feeding the world can leave the loaves and fishes in fragments. So if I read the Gospel of John correctly, the church needs to offer more than endless volunteer opportunities. Christ's servants need rest and restoration. And if it's not available in the church, the most committed servants will eventually start looking for the exits. The fragments will be lost. And Jesus would have some very stern words for the disciples who let that happen. Professional literature suggests some ways to avoid burnout. And some of these should sound very familiar to the church. One is relationships. People are less likely to suffer burnout if they have strong connections with others and can share stories about their lives. The more Home Church can foster real relationships between members, the more we will be a place of restoration rather than fragmentation. I pray that as we serve our neighbors, we will make an effort to truly connect with one another. I've heard teachers of young children talk about parallel play, where the children play side by side but don't get involved in each other's activity. And I pray that as we serve in home church, we will not engage in parallel service, but that we will serve together, building restorative relationships that bring wholeness. Another defense against burnout is personal growth, learning new things, serving in new ways. These are good ways to keep engaged and energized in any work. The church especially should offer opportunities for growth because God wants us to grow. What can home church do to help you grow spiritually and deepen your faith? What can we do to help each of you make new use of your spiritual gifts? Delving deeply into spiritual work would keep us engaged and might even help us rediscover that fragile treasure called idealism. Finally, we can't avoid burnout if we don't rest. That is just obvious. The church can shine here because we can offer Sabbath rest, the restorative peace that God not only desires but commands for God's people. How can we make church life more restful instead of more stressful? Do you need a volunteer sabbatical? How can we help you? The church is marvelously equipped to provide its people with the things we need to prevent burnout, relationships, personal growth, and Sabbath rest. I don't know how good a job we do. I won't know unless you tell me. Rick and Margaret and I want to know. How are you doing? Are you feeling fragmented? What can this church do to pick up the pieces, gather all together that none may be lost? John's gospel reveals the depth of Jesus' concern. The verb he uses for lost can be translated in other ways. Gather the fragments, he says, that none may be discarded, that none may be destroyed, that none may perish. Later in John's gospel, he'll use the same word as he prays for God to protect the disciples. I protected them in your name that you have given me. I guarded them, and not one of them was lost. Jesus trusts in God's abundance, but he also shows care for what God gives him. Losing a few crumbs of bread is probably not a big deal, but losing people is. There is bread in abundance, but there is only one you, and only one you, and only one you. And Jesus is not willing that you should be lost. The Jesus who sends us to feed the world is also the Jesus who cares for what is broken into pieces. We are 5 loaves and 2 fish, but we are also the disciples called to gather the fragments. The church that sent my convo friends and sends all servants of Christ into the world must also be the place where all the friends and all the servants return to find wholeness, because the whole world depends on it. Amen.